September 25th, 2000. Boston Celtics star Paul Pierce was inside a nightclub in Boston. He was 22 years old, 2 seasons into his NBA career, and already beginning to look like the next great Celtic. Then everything changed. An altercation broke out, and within moments, Paul Pierce was fighting for his life. Pierce was stabbed, not once, not twice, but 11 times. His face, his neck, his back, his body, and during the attack, a bottle was reportedly smashed over his head. Pierce was rushed to the hospital. One would penetrate deep enough into his chest that doctors had to perform surgery. Think about that for a second. This isn't a basketball injury. We're not talking about a torn ACL, a broken hand, or a sprained ankle. Paul Pierce had just been attacked with a knife 11 times. Forget the basketball. He was fortunate to be alive. The Boston Celtics season was scheduled to begin just over a month later. Nobody would have blamed Pierce if he needed months and months to recover. Nobody would have blamed him if basketball was the last thing on his mind. But instead, Paul Pierce did something that still doesn't even sound real. 35 days after the attack, he played in Boston's opening game. And then he played the next one, and the next one. Paul Pierce went on to play all 82 games. He averaged more than 25 points per game. 5 years later, he would nearly lead Boston. 8 years later, he would stand on the same court where Larry Bird once celebrated, holding a championship trophy. And by the time his career ended, the kid who grew up in Los Angeles dreaming about the NBA would become one of the greatest Boston Celtics ever. And this is the story of Paul Pierce, the superstar who survived 11 stab wounds and somehow became even tougher afterward. Paul Pierce was born in Oakland, California in 1977 before growing up in Inglewood. And there's an incredible irony to his story. Pierce grew up in Los Angeles, Lakers territory, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Showtime. The Boston Celtics were supposed to be the enemy. But basketball didn't immediately come easily to Pierce. At Inglewood High School, he initially struggled to establish himself. He wasn't immediately treated like some future NBA superstar. But Pierce kept developing. He grew, his game improved, and eventually, the kid who once struggled to make an impact became one of California's top high school players. That eventually took him to Kansas. At the University of Kansas, Pierce developed into a star. He played under Roy Williams and alongside future NBA players, including Raif Lafayette. Pierce could score from the outside, post smaller defenders, rebound, create his own shot, and most importantly, he seemed comfortable when games became difficult. By his junior season, Pierce was averaging more than 20 points per game. NBA scouts knew who he was, and in 1998, Pierce declared for the NBA draft. He was expected to go high, but draft night didn't go according to plan. Pick after pick went by. Michael Olowokandi, Mike Bibby, Antoine Jamison, Vince Carter, Robert Taylor, Jason Williams, Larry Hughes, Dirk Nowitzki. And then, at number 10, the Boston Celtics selected Paul Pierce. Pierce never forgot the 9 players that were taken before him, and Boston was about to discover that several teams had made an enormous mistake. Pierce entered a franchise carrying enormous expectations. This wasn't just another NBA team. This was Boston. Bill Russell, John Havlicek, Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish. 16 championships at the time. But by 1998, those glory years felt increasingly distant. Larry Bird was gone. The Celtics hadn't won a championship since 1986. Len Bias had passed away before ever playing an NBA game. Reggie Lewis had passed away in 1993. Boston was searching for another franchise player. That was until Paul Pierce arrived. As a rookie, he averaged roughly 16.5 points, 6 rebounds, and nearly 2 steals per game. He finished third in the Rookie of the Year voting. Year 2, he improved again. Pierce was becoming Boston's future. Then came September 2000, and suddenly, basketball did not seem to matter. September 25th, Paul Pierce was at the Buzz Club, a nightclub in Boston's Theater District. An altercation occurred. Paul Pierce became involved. Then the attack began. He was stabbed repeatedly, 11 wounds in total. Pierce later described injuries to his face, neck, and back. A bottle was broken over his head. One stab wound penetrated his chest and damaged his lung. Pierce was rushed to the Tufts New England Medical Center. Doctors performed surgery, and there is one detail that makes the entire situation even crazier. Paul Pierce was wearing a leather jacket. He had credited that jacket would help him protect him during the attack. Without it, who knows? The NBA almost lost Paul Pierce before most basketball fans had even seen what he could become. But Paul Pierce survived, and then he wanted to play basketball. 35 days. That's how much time passed between Pierce being stabbed and Boston's first game of the 2001 regular season. October 31st, Celtics versus Pistons. Paul Pierce was in the lineup. He was not sitting courtside, not giving an interview about his recovery. He was playing. And Pierce didn't simply appear for some inspirational 5-minute cameo. He scored 28 points. And then he continued playing. November, December, January, February, March, April. When Boston's regular season ended, Paul Pierce had appeared in 82 games. For people not familiar with basketball, that's all of them. This man had been stabbed 11 times approximately 1 month before the season and didn't miss a single regular season game. And statistically, it became his breakout year. Pierce averaged approximately 25 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists. This wasn't someone barely surviving the season. He became a star. But Pierce later admitted that physically recovering was only part of what happened. The psychological impact stayed with him forever. Years later, Pierce spoke openly about what the stabbing did to him mentally. He described experiencing depression and paranoia afterward. He became uncomfortable in crowds. He reportedly had police protection around his home. He struggled with sleep. Think about how strange that must have been. Thousands of fans are watching Paul Pierce play basketball, and they're thinking this guy is fearless. Meanwhile, away from basketball, he's processing the reality that he was almost killed. And Pierce has said basketball became an escape. On the court, things made sense. There were rules, teammates, officials, a scoreboard. For 48 minutes, he could focus on basketball instead of what happened that night. And perhaps that's part of why Paul Pierce played all 82 games. Basketball wasn't interfering with his recovery. Basketball was the recovery. By the early 2000s, Boston had an identity. Paul Pierce, Antoine Walker. Walker was loud, confident, unpredictable. Pierce was developing into one of the NBA's premier scorers. Together, they brought meaningful basketball back to Boston. The 01-02 season changed everything. Paul Pierce made his first All-Star team. Boston won 49 games. And for the first time since 1995, the Celtics reached the playoffs. They beat Philadelphia. They beat Detroit. Suddenly, Boston was in the Eastern Conference Finals against Jason Kidd and the New Jersey Nets. And Game 3 produced one of Paul Pierce's first legendary playoff moments. Boston entered the fourth quarter down by 21 points. Pierce took over. The Celtics completed what was then the largest fourth quarter comeback in NBA playoff history. Pierce scored 19 points in the fourth. Boston won. For a moment, it looked like Pierce might take the Celtics all the way to the finals. But New Jersey recovered. The Nets won the next 3 games. Boston was eliminated. But still, Paul Pierce had arrived. The question was, could Boston build a championship team around him? And for years, the answer looked like no. The Celtics gradually fell backward. Antoine Walker was traded, teammates changed, coaches changed. The roster never really seemed good enough. Pierce kept scoring. 02-03, 26 points per game. 05-06, 27 points per game. He was making all-star teams, putting up numbers, hitting big shots. But Boston wasn't getting any closer to a championship. And then came rock bottom. 2006-2007. Paul Pierce dealt with injuries. The Celtics lost 18 consecutive games at one point. They finished 24-58, the second worst record in the NBA. Paul Pierce was approaching 30. His prime was not going to last forever. And now a legitimate question emerged. Was Paul Pierce going to spend his entire prime carrying bad Celtics teams? Trade rumors intensified. Boston had a decision. trade Pierce and rebuild, or make one enormous attempt to win around him? Danny Ainge chose option 2. And within one summer, everything changed. Summer 2007, Boston traded for Ray Allen, already huge. Then came the move that changed the NBA, Kevin Garnett. The Celtics suddenly had Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, Ray Allen, 3 stars who had spent years carrying franchises, 3 veterans desperate to win. And immediately, Boston became terrifying. The Celtics went from 24 wins to 68. That's a 42-win improvement, one of the greatest single-season turnarounds in NBA history. But regular season dominance didn't matter. Pierce's entire legacy was about to be judged on the playoffs. It's the second round. Boston Celtics, Cleveland Cavaliers, Paul Pierce, LeBron James, Game 7. TD Garden, win or go home. And Pierce produced one of the greatest games of his career. LeBron scored 45, but Pierce answered with 41. Basket after basket, big shot after big shot. 2 stars refusing to let their season end. Boston ended up surviving, 97-92. Pierce had beaten LeBron. Next came Detroit. Boston won again. And for the first time in his career, Paul Pierce is going to the NBA Finals. But waiting for him, of course, the Los Angeles Lakers, the team from the city where he grew up. The Celtics' greatest rival, Kobe Bryant, Paul Pierce, Boston, Los Angeles. It couldn't have been scripted any better. Game 1, third quarter. Pierce collided with teammate Kendrick Perkins. Pierce went down clutching his knee. He was carried off the floor. Then came the image everyone remembers, the wheelchair. Pierce was taken toward the locker room. Boston fans thought their star's final might be over. But then, minutes later, Pierce emerged from the tunnel. The building exploded. He returned to the game. He hit back-to-back three-pointers. Boston won. And yes, as we all know, the wheelchair incident has become one of the most joked about moments in NBA history. Pierce himself has joked about it. But whatever happened in that tunnel, the larger point remains. Pierce was finally on the stage he'd spent a decade trying to reach, and he wasn't letting anything remove him from it. Boston took control of the series. Then came Game 6, June 17th, 2008. TD Garden, Celtics versus Lakers. Boston didn't simply beat Los Angeles. They destroyed them, 131-92. 39 points. The final seconds disappeared. The crowd erupted. Kevin Garnett screamed, "Anything is possible." And Paul Pierce, the kid from Inglewood who grew up in Los Angeles, who had been drafted 10th overall, who had survived 11 stab wounds, who endured losing season after losing season, was finally an NBA champion. And then came the announcement. The 2008 NBA Finals MVP, Paul Pierce. He averaged roughly 22 points per game in the series. He defended Kobe Bryant for stretches. He made huge shots. And after 10 seasons in Boston, Paul Pierce had finally reached the top. Pierce's nickname deserves its own chapter, The Truth. And it came from another legend, Shaquille O'Neal. In 2001, Pierce dropped 42 points against Shaq's Lakers. Afterward, Shaq reportedly pulled a reporter to the side and told him, "Paul Pierce is the truth." The nickname stuck, and honestly, it fits perfectly. Pierce wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the highest jumper. He wasn't built like LeBron. He didn't have Kobe's aesthetic footwork. He wasn't a physical alien. Pierce just knew how to get buckets. The pump fake, the step back, use the shoulder, create space, draw contact, mid-range jumper, 3, post up, whatever you gave him, he found an answer. He wasn't always pretty, but he was effective, and that's the truth. Boston entered the 08-09 season looking capable of repeating. At one point, the Celtics were 27-2. Then Kevin Garnett injured his knee. He eventually missed the postseason. Without KG, Boston couldn't repeat. They lost to Orlando in the second round before 2010 gave them another opportunity. Boston returned to the NBA Finals again. Celtics versus Lakers. This time, the series went 7 games. Boston entered the fourth quarter of Game 7 with the lead. They were 12 minutes away from another championship. But Kobe and the Lakers came back. Los Angeles ended up winning 83-79, and that loss hurt. especially because Paul Pierce would never reach the NBA Finals again. The Celtics remained competitive, but age was catching up to them. Ray Allen eventually left for Miami. Garnett slowed down. Pierce was getting older. And after the 2012-2013 season, Boston made the decision nobody could have imagined a decade earlier. Paul Pierce was traded to the Brooklyn Nets. Pierce and Garnett went together. Boston received a massive package of draft picks. At the time, it felt like the end of an era. Years later, those picks helped Boston build another contender. But for Pierce personally, for the first time in his NBA career, he wasn't a Celtic. As we all know, Brooklyn didn't become the super team people expected. But Pierce still had moments. Then he joined Washington, and something incredible happened. Old Paul Pierce became one of the most entertaining clutch players in basketball. The 2015 playoffs, Washington versus Toronto. Pierce talked trash. He hit huge shots. Then against Atlanta, Game 3, tie game, the final seconds. Pierce gets the ball, steps back, bank shot, game. The reporter asked him afterwards, "Did you call bank?" And Pierce responded, "I called a game." Classic Paul Pierce. Later in the series, Pierce hit what appeared to be another miraculous game-tying shot, but replay showed the ball was still in his hand when time expired. His Washington run ended. But even near 40, the truth still wanted the final shot. Pierce spent his final NBA seasons with the Los Angeles Clippers, and there was something poetic about it. The kid from Inglewood, who became a legend in Boston, was finishing his career back in Los Angeles. By then, Pierce wasn't a superstar anymore. The explosiveness was fading, the minutes decreased. Eventually, in 2017, Paul Pierce retired. But Boston made sure his story ended correctly. Pierce signed a ceremonial contract with the Celtics so he could officially retire as a member of the franchise. Then in 2018, Boston raised his number, 34, to the TD Garden rafters. Right alongside the legends he spent his career chasing. This is where Paul Pierce sometimes gets underrated, because today's NBA conversation loves rankings. Top 10, top 20, who's better, who's overrated. And Pierce has almost become a meme because of some of the things he said after retirement. But separate television personality Paul Pierce from basketball player Paul Pierce. Because basketball player Paul Pierce was serious. 10-time NBA All-Star, 4-time All-NBA selection, NBA champion, Finals MVP, more than 26,000 career points, more than 7,500 rebounds, more than 4,700 rebounds. One of the greatest scorers in Celtics history, one of the greatest clutch players of his generation, and eventually a basketball Hall of Famer. Was Paul Pierce Michael Jordan? No. Was he LeBron? No. Was he Kobe? No. But there was a long period where Paul Pierce could walk into an arena against almost anyone in basketball and give them a 30-piece. But if you want to understand Paul Pierce's career, go back to September 25th, 2000, before the championship, before Garnett, before Ray Allen, before LeBron became his playoff rival, before the final MVP, before his name got entered into the rafters. Paul Pierce was lying in a hospital bed after being stabbed 11 times. His NBA career was only 2 years old. There was no guarantee he would become a superstar. No guarantee he'd play another game. No guarantee he'd even psychologically recover from what happened. 35 days later, he played, and he played all 82. And then 8 years later, he stood in Boston holding the Finals MVP trophy. That's Paul Pierce's career. It wasn't perfect. There were bad teams, playoff failures, trade rumors, injuries, controversies, heartbreak, and years where Boston looked nowhere close to competing for a championship. But Pierce stayed long enough to see everything change. From 24 wins to 66. From almost being traded to becoming Finals MVP. From being stabbed 11 times to playing every single game that season. And from the 10th pick in the draft to having number 34 hanging alongside the greatest players in Celtics history. Paul Pierce wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the strongest, he wasn't the most athletic. But if there was one thing he proved repeatedly, it was that getting rid of him was extremely difficult. 11 stab wounds couldn't do it, years of losing couldn't do it, LeBron couldn't do it in 2008, the Lakers couldn't do it in 2008. And eventually, Paul Pierce got exactly what he spent his career chasing. A championship, a Finals MVP, and a permanent place in NBA history. That's why Shaq gave him the perfect nickname, because after everything Paul Pierce survived, everything he accomplished, and everything he gave Boston, there was really only one name that could possibly fit: the truth.